to be able to welcome Jim Ackerman back to the GSD. It really is an honor to have him here, and of course to have Jill here as well, and so many of you, and Professor Seckler, Pat, everybody else. It's great. For those of you who are not used to this kind of session, you know that we have a very informal session under this rubric of now. Basically, our guest gets to speak for something between 20 minutes to half an hour, and then we open it up for conversation. I'm also very, very pleased and happy that Professor Erika Naginski has agreed to join me here. I'm sure you also know Professor Naginski's work, and of course I think both Erika and Jim have also had some kind of interaction in the past, so I thought this would be a really great opportunity. I don't want to spend a long time telling you about all the amazing things that Professor Ackerman has done, but you do know that he's really one of the most important historians of architecture and urbanism that we have, and he has been at Harvard for a while as the Arthur Kingsley professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture, the author of the Cortile del Belvedere, the architecture of Michelangelo, books on Palladio, Palladio's villas, the villa form and ideology of country houses, publications on drawing. I think what is really important about so many of these publications is that one could really claim that they have always involved history in relation to modes of projective thinking. I think they haven't been really books which have looked at a certain material and simply, in a sense, interpreted that material, but there's always been a certain sense of thinking and contextualizing these works in a much wider context than they would normally be. And I think today's presentation, which is part of some of the latest work that Jim has been working on Palladio, is probably no exception, where I think because of the anniversary, you've been very much involved with a lot of discussions connected with Palladio. But I think for those of you who don't know, and maybe Jim will say something about this, many years ago here at the GSD, there was quite a lot of collaboration that was going on between, for example, Professor Ackerman and Howard Burns and Bill Mitchell, where people who were dealing with computation and people who were dealing with history came together to actually use tools of computer graphics as a way of imagining hypothetical conditions of projects, for example, that weren't realized or their context wasn't quite clear and things like this. So I think those collaborations were very, very positive. And I'm certainly hoping that we would see more of that kind of collaboration. As an aside, I've heard from Scott Cohen, Professor Cohen, that maybe there is not as much enthusiasm about history today as there might have been at an earlier period, and perhaps this could be true. Certainly, your presence here today proves to me that there is still a great deal of enthusiasm about the importance of history as part of the project of the future. We're always sort of thinking, I think in the school, that it's really critical in terms of how we're engaged with design, that we don't only think about the tools of design that are open to us now in terms of the future, but that we really are aware of and utilize, in a sense, and benefit from what we can gain from history. And who better to really open up, for example, the relationship between architecture and the city than Professor James Ackerman. So I'm really honored that you are here, and so I hope that you will welcome Professor Ackerman to this session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen. We're old friends from the time that Mohsen made my house into a typical Cambridge house, that from a Cambridge house to something splendid with openness and light. I'm going to try to make this talk both about my process and about a problem which constitutes something new in terms of the title of this series, and shall I say, a discovery that came simply out of following a track. I would say that my favorite way of doing architectural history is to start with a thing, a drawing or a building or something that is there before it came. And at the same time, if that doesn't happen at the moment, I like to study architecture as a focus of both culture and ideology. And this problem that I want to tell you about fills both sides. You see on the screen here the square of Bologna with the Church of San Petronio, which was a Gothic building in which the original architect had arrived only at the first story. And in 1572, an effort was made to bring architects together to compete for the completion of the facade. And it was assumed at the beginning that it had to be Gothic because it started Gothic. And so you have the kind of contribution to the competition at the upper right, which was typical of a lot that architects proposed, that kept what was already there and then added other features on top. That was a very arbitrary process because, in fact, the stuff behind wasn't built yet. The forward part of this church was only 1 story high still, and nobody knew at that time how tall it was going to be. But that didn't discourage the competitors. On the lower left, you see the first effort that Palladio made, because he was one of those called, in collaboration with a local. And he was trying to keep what was there already in this drawing, which everybody wanted him to do, and to get it to be classical. And that was a terrible problem. It was a problem throughout Renaissance architecture because the proportions of classical architecture didn't fit Gothic or any medieval churches because they were built very high without regard for the proportions. And if you wanted to put columns onto the facade of the building, you had to fool around in extraordinary ways. And for example, you see those that flank the main portal are classical, but they're of the wrong proportion because you couldn't get up that high unless you made them thin. And then in the lower right, you see Palladio totally rejecting the order to keep what was there already and producing two ideas for a facade which would change everything. That made it possible for him to get those columns in the proper proportions. He too didn't know how high it had to be, and so I'm sure he favored that situation by simply making the profile more lower than it would otherwise be. Now, nothing happened in this competition, which took place in 1572, because the people in charge couldn't agree what to do. And the thing opened again in 1578, when Palladio was only 2 years from the end of his life, and he presented this drawing, which didn't show up until the 1970s, when a scholar found them in a library at Oxford, Worcester College. This elevation was recognized from the literary descriptions to be Palladio's offering. It was presented, and the person in charge of Bologna liked it and sent it down to the Pope for approval, and the Pope turned it down flat, so nothing happened. But this is where I started, this extraordinary drawing. And I always wondered that it was so huge, that it was out of scale with its environment. And I thought it would help if I could visualize it in its environment. That brought to mind a seminar which Bill Mitchell and Howard Burns led in the late 90s, in which there was a prize fellow who was already an architect, who made a reconstruction of a Palladio church from a drawing. So I thought, I'll get this guy, and together we'll work on that drawing and find out what it would look like in real life. First of all, it took me about 8 months to find Scott Schamberg, who was my collaborator, and I finally realized that if I went to the AIA, I might find out where he was. Well, he was a senior architect at Perkins and Will in New York, which is an obvious place to be, and was delighted with the idea of going ahead. He said that the computer simulations had gotten a lot better than when he did them in those times, and so we would go ahead and produce an effort to reconstruct this thing. And here is Scott's work in the piazza below. Above, you see the way it really is. And it's remarkably evocative of how huge the thing is. You look at the little people on the steps up there, and you see that it's just superhuman. And it gave me the first inkling that Palladio's late church designs were something totally different from anything that had happened before, not only in scale, but in majesty and what contemporaries call magnificence. I have to say that the drawing didn't really work very well. There were things that are not acceptable in architectural practice as you can see in the reconstruction, the side flank of the portico bumps up against that wing, but that's the way it's drawn, so what we do. Anyway, where did he get this idea? Well, one possibility is from the Pantheon in Rome, that second century facade there, which really is obvious because that woodcut on the right is from Palladio's 4 books. So we know it's relevant to his thinking. The 4 books were published in 1570, and this is 1578. So this was a start. This is probably why the Pope didn't like it, because it was too much of antiquity. So what we have is the beginning of a series of late works in which Palladio attempted to change the nature of the fronts of buildings. Something's missing here. The reconstruction. I knew I'd have trouble. Anyway, where is it? After Palladio's death, there was no facade, and the one that you see here, which is the way it is today, is it was built in the 1590s, and it may not have much to do with Palladio. Then also recently, a drawing was found with a plan in it for a portico facade, like San Petronio. And Scott also made a wonderful reconstruction of that, which we're obliged to forget. But it too showed an effort to project this magnificence onto the environment in Venice. And there's a passage in the 4 books that talks about how churches should be in a major spot in the city and project the character of the city's ambitions onto the environment. Now, this I have to inject at this time how the idea of magnificence occurred to me. It was a term generally used before, and I went to a conference in New York at Columbia, and lo and behold, one of the other speakers, named Tracy Cooper, gave a talk on the magnificence of Palladio's churches in Venice. And so I was talking about the same thing as she was, with no connection. And then, but she had a piece of information that turned out very important to me, and I'll get to that in a moment. A literary piece exactly contemporary with Palladio's work, which brings out the reasons for magnificence. Now, a second thing happened at a conference in Yale in a few months after the Columbia one, that I ran into a colleague who was teaching history at Yale, Kurt Förster, and he told me that he had a student who had written a dissertation about magnificence. So it got published. I found it. And this is how things happen. I mean, just by pure chance. The portico facade was also in a drawing after Palladio's death, which is why we can get along without seeing what happened. This is perhaps more convincing, though. This is the Church of the Redentore, and you have up above the way it looks now, and below Scott's reconstruction of it, and it gives you an idea of the plan that Palladio made to present to the Senate that wanted to build a church, thanking the Lord for keeping Venice, or for the end of the plague of 1575 in Venice. And Palladio wanted desperately to have this central planned church with a porch, and the Senate that had to vote on it just narrowly beat out the people who approved of it, who belonged to a group of Rome-oriented nobles, but they were outnumbered by those who were more restricted in their view and wanted to keep Venetian traditions, and so they said they'd have to have a longitudinal church. Now, it happened that the drawings for this were preserved in the RIBA in London. Here you see section and elevation. I didn't want to crowd it with the plan, which also exists. When I wrote my book on Palladio, I didn't know that this was for the Redentore. What happened was that not long ago, in a journal of which I'm on the board of editors, a young student of Manfredo Tafuri did a great article in which he revealed that the measurements on the drawings fit exactly into the plot that was described in terms of its measurement in the Senate deliberations. So this indeed was a Redentore project, and in my book I called it something else, which it was thought to be at that time. Palladio did finally realize a church of this kind in Mazere at his Barbaro villa, a chapel that looks not very different from this, but very small scale and magnificent in concept, but not in size. So it's interesting that the patron of Palladio at Mazere was Daniele Barbaro, who was a great connoisseur of architecture and wrote an edition of Vitruvius, and Palladio illustrated it. So they were very closely knit. And this is the moment to go back to this piece of literature, which was a essay that was composed by a Venetian, Paolo Paruta, in 1578. That is exactly the time of the design at Bologna. And it's called Della Perfezione, on perfection. And it's an essay on political and moral virtue. And very aptly, it takes the form of a symposium with a lot of gentlemen in it. And one of the gentlemen is Daniele Barbaro. And Paruta has Daniele Barbaro talk about magnificence. And he said that the person who is privileged and noble has to be magnificent in the buildings that he supports and builds. And I'll read you the passage where he says this. And magnificence is described as a virtue, not like the McMansions we see around today, which are usually regarded as a vice, but as a way in which you give the citizen pride in his culture and his fellow citizens. Now, this had to do with the peculiar situation of Venice. In Venice, the people called nobles were not nobles in any other sense of the European understanding. They didn't belong to the Holy Roman Empire. They weren't princes of the church. They were dukes and grand dukes and counts and other people of titles that were inherited, whereas these Venetians were merchants who belonged to families that had won themselves certain privileges in Venice, but they didn't belong to this aristocratic sphere. So it was Venice was a seedbed for Republican thinking. Now, the things that the other people, other aristocrats were doing, manifested a very different kind of showing off than the ones in Venice. So let's just listen for a moment to Barbaro's statement in Peruta's book. Magnificence, responded Barbaro, as a virtue of nobility, is itself worthy of not just any work, so there is not often occasion to demonstrate it, but in those things where it is usually employed, which one does only on rare occasions, like banquets, weddings, buildings, where it becomes one to spend without consideration of expense, but only to the grandeur and beauty of the work. Barbaro adds that other appropriate uses are for feast, public games, livery, and, quote, the building of temples, of palaces, or of other public or private edifices. Such things, if they have suitable grandeur, and if they are made with noble devices, and with suitable decorum, they render the man worthy of the name Magnifico. And that title is given to wealthy and civic-minded people. There's also another person in the dialogue who warns that you have to be careful. You can't overdo it in this respect, or it doesn't constitute a virtue. And Palladio himself claimed that he was doing this because in building buildings, he very rarely used precious stones throughout the building. On a facade, yes, but in the building as a whole, this one is brick in the rear, if you see up above, the sides and the dome and everything, the brick. Simple materials, and you find this in all the villas, the stucco columns on brick. So a moderation of all of this is possible. Now, as far as the origins of the kind of thing we saw in the Redentore Church, we must consider St. Peter. St. Peter's, in an engraving of 1569 that was published so that Palladio could see it, in Michelangelo's design had a portico like this. So Michelangelo beat him to it. And this is interesting. This is a reconstruction by Kenneth Conant, who taught right here in the GSD. And Kenneth Conant was doing the same thing in his terms and times as Scott was doing, helping me. And Kenneth Conant was helped by John Coolidge, who was an architectural historian, a contemporary of mine, in then Department of Fine Arts. So Michelangelo's behind this and something else we'll see in a moment. Here on the left you see Palladio's concept of urban magnificence, not church but civic. Here's the loggia where the Venetian representative in Venice had his headquarters, on the left. And on the right, a project, we don't know for what, in which you have this club. Now, the feature I want to point to is what we call the colossal order. And the colossal order is one that embraces the entire main portion of a building, 2 stories usually. And it became the vocabulary of public buildings for later generations. Where did this come from? Here you see a palace in Venice, the Valmarana of 1565, and on the right you see Michelangelo's project for the Capitoline Hill. The ideal civic center, a paradoxical ideal because it was all paid for by the Pope, but it was supposed to represent the independence of the Roman people, who were never independent of the Pope. Here we compare the actual built building, and you see Michelangelo was the pioneer in the colossal order. And this certainly just carried on throughout history from this point on. And it had the same significance as the church facades that we've been seeing. Now, the most extraordinary instance of this from Palladio was this palace in Vicenza, the Porto Barberan, which would have been maybe 7 bays wide. If nobody could afford to finish the palaces in Vicenza because there was economic downturn that we know about, and a lot of them are only partial, most of them. So this is almost late Baroque in its expressiveness, and from there went the vocabulary of the Baroque in the use of the portico facade. It didn't have much influence for a while. I mean, actually, none of the Palladio ones were built, but it only got its imprimatur when Carlo Borromeo, the cardinal who was so powerful in the Counter-Reformation, published a book in the 1590s in which he approved of the portico, the freestanding portico, and then it took off as a part of the vocabulary of Baroque and later architecture. Here are 4 instances which are labeled, so I don't have to tell you what they are. Both churches and public buildings employ the freestanding portico and the colossal order. This becomes the statement of absolutism in Europe. And it comes to America. Now, here we were trying not to be absolutist, but there wasn't anything else to look to, with the result that American architecture exuded the magnificence of earlier times. Here you see Jefferson's University of Virginia, which has the Pantheon with a freestanding portico as the library, and little colossal ordered pavilions for the faculty along in front. The president's house, another instance of the colossal order in the freestanding porch. A railroad station in New York, and finally the Jefferson Memorial, which looks exactly like the Redentore. So this, you could see how ideology plays its role, and then it gets translated into something quite different. One wonders what the attraction was in American, in the early days of American building to the aristocratic architectural ideal. But that's for another time. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, thank you very, very much. A couple of sort of maybe small observations. One of the things that I think is interesting with what you are doing with Palladio is the way that also perhaps, because we're in the context of a school of architecture and landscape architecture and urban planning and design, is the way that Canaletto actually utilized the work of Palladio in the context of these drawings that he made as part of the series of Capricci, but actually there was a particular series that were known as drawings that were part of the tradition of Fantasia, of a kind of imaginary drawings. And I think this whole relationship between things that exist and things that are imagined, in a way, is very important, very interesting. And in the context of Canaletto, for those of you who are not familiar, he actually took existing buildings, transplanted them in different locations than maybe they were intended, or combined real and imaginary locations, real and imaginary locations of buildings. With the result that you started imagining a place as different than it was already. And I think that's an interesting point about the relationship of architecture to its context, or the relationship of architecture to public space, to the city. So I think that's perhaps just because of the fact that inherent in the way that you're working are certain modes of projection. Perhaps that's something that would be interesting to discuss. How is history, how is the making of architecture also something that's imagined in relation to an urban context or a different context? The other thing that I think would be interesting to get your thoughts, especially when you're bringing the concept of magnificenza or the concept of magnificence to the present, is basically what happened to it and what are its contemporary possibilities. Because what was interesting to hear about the concept of magnificence is the degree to which magnificence is not simply to do with the appearance of the building, but also the kinds of values and conditions that it seems to represent, to do with patronage, and in fact the kinds of content that is accommodated within the building. And it's not simply a question of the external appearance as a semantic mode of communication. There seems to be a sort of ideology that is behind that appearance that seems to be important. Whereas when it came to modernism and the modern movement, the crisis of modern movement, it seems that at some point gave rise to the importance of the discussion of the concept of monumentality. And in some ways it would be interesting to talk what is the difference between magnificence, or the phenomenon of magnificence, and the phenomenon of monumentality, because modern architects felt that in some sense the phenomenon of monumentality was one way to bring the public architecture, since so much of the efforts of modernism had been to address the question of housing, and the shift now in some way from the domestic environment to that of the public sphere. So I think it would be interesting to find out whether there is a particular moment where magnificence in some way stopped and monumentality started? And in a way, what is the relationship of the concept of magnificence, not to be too instrumental, but what is the relationship of magnificence to contemporary projections of...
Mohsen, it's a fascinating question, and you've touched upon something I'd never really quite thought about, because as Jim was talking about a kind of proleptic Baroque feel in this projective colossal order, of course, I immediately thought of its reappropriation in an absolutist context with Ardoin-Mansart, for example, and the kinds of public squares that he is designing for Paris. And what's so interesting is that the Place des Victoires, the Place Vendôme, Louis le Grand Vendôme, which are based on the kinds of models that Jim, of course, is talking about, are meant as facades for domestic architecture, and then suddenly the monument begins to appear in the 18th century, and suddenly this colossal order takes an almost scenographic role. It's very odd. It almost recedes back during the Enlightenment as a stage for a monument. And, of course, there's a moment when the two words are rhetorically at odds with each other during the 18th century.
Well, of course, the Beaux-Arts comes into the picture because,
Certainly.
in a way, the Beaux-Arts represented the effort to get back to magnificence. And then in early modernism, the Beaux-Arts was the enemy, and there was an effort to retreat from that tradition. And the question of when the monument comes into the picture is interesting to consider.
Does it have to do with the fact that the civil society or the social fabric which gave rise to magnificence was eroded? I think that the erosion of the social fabric happened before, and then the architecture expressed that erosion.
Yeah.
I think that's often forgotten. It seems that architects are talking in their own little niche, but we're much more reactive rather than guiding developments.
What do you mean? Can you speak a little bit more about what do you mean by social fabric?
Well, all these men believed in this concept of magnificence. So if you get to industrialization and societies become more complex, it's no longer a model which you can uphold. And that's where it becomes scenographic, as you put it. But this has to do with the fact that the communities in which these buildings were built were getting increasing, the social structures were increasingly complex. Then the modernists basically respond to this and say these symbols are utterly meaningless. And to basically return to a public architecture in this era, which again has meaning, is therefore incredibly complex because the social structure has completely eroded, which gave rise to magnificence.
I would love to hear a word or two from Professor Sekler, but maybe I could ask Erika if you had some other comments or follow-up. I see you have lots of lovely notes.
Well, there are two things that are very different. One has to do with the way you see this kind of projective urban statement sitting in some kind of dialectical relationship with the way that you've written about villas and the kind of rhetoric or virtue and vices that emerges around the villas and paradigm. So I wondered about that, generally speaking. And the other has to do with the way you approach things. It's so lovely to hear you, on the one hand, describe with great care a particular historical circumstance, to tie a text to an image, to think about the rhetorical and cultural context of a thing, and then, on the other hand, unfold it in the beautiful way that you do to present a much larger problem that hits us today. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more or think through, all of us, about then what kind of notion or double notion of history is at work there. So those were two very different things.
I think I started with the double, which is a architectural historian has uh, two promptings. One is to understand a situation or a design or project, and to be promoted simply by the pleasure of experiencing the thing into investigating it farther. And the other is to deal with architecture as part of the history of civilization and as one of the humanities in a way. And in my lifetime, I've, for one reason or another, I had to travel a lot less since 1980 than I did before. And so it was less possible to get fired up by something that I saw. And often I would just get going from texts or the like, and that's a different kind of work. It's work with the history of ideas. And as we were talking about just before we got together, after making a couple of trips to India very recently, I got a very different approach to the way we treat Western architecture. We have a very aesthetic approach to Western architecture. We take very little interest in color and texture and individuality of detail and that kind of thing. And we don't emphasize the craft, but rather the conception, which is well, it puts emphasis entirely on the architect, and this is I've been trying to think of how we could change the approach that would give us more insight into this. When I was at the Yale Palladio conference, one of the things that turned me on most was a photograph that a design professor showed of some of the moldings in one of the buildings. They were way up high, and I'd never seen them, and they had a message that I'd never received. A visual communication like that, and that's what I mean to getting the visceral as well as the intellectual.
That's right. Edward, could you make some comments?
Remember that there's a little essay by Gideon called The New Monumentality.
Mhm.
I remember that.
Yes.
And I need that little book where it is to see when that happened. But
It's in the 40s, I think.
yeah,
40, yeah, 40.
and also it's remarkable that the Zion Congress is moved to really very moving places like Ragusa, Dubrovnik. You know? You have it all there. You have monumentality in that spirit and magnificent.
Yeah.
That is authentic because the people behind it are in that spirit. When Ragusa lost its independence, when the republic, when the Venetian power collapsed, the nobility decided not to procreate. It was the end of a period. indeed, the point you made that the connection between magnificence and monumentality becomes telling when you think who are the people behind it. The new monumentality is around us in all the fake, enormous Victorian villas that helped to the collapse of the real estate world. Because the people who ordered them, in reality, weren't real able to pay for it. So we have the total hollowness of what happened there. But they aimed for monumentality in whatever way they understood this monument. So indeed, it's very revealing to think about that age, Venice of all places, everything was so regulated and ordered, even the dress that people were allowed to wear. And so where indeed the money had to be spent, for example, on the school, public buildings. The members were supposed to and did support these things. They deserved then the magnificence of the scholar. Let's say, if you think one of the great scholars, everything, every register was pulled to make it magnificent.
Maybe we could open this up. Scott, I was just wondering whether you have any thoughts about this question of drawings and the reconstructions that that Jim has been working with, and the relationship between basically the kind of visualization in relation to the sectional and elevational drawings and that kind of space that is there, because as elements of representation, they're also very different qualitatively, probably, from the sectional elevation drawing. So do you have any thoughts or comments about any of the things Jim talked about, or specifically about this question of drawings or the projective drawings that are used to?
Well, obviously I'm very taken by these representations, these models, because I think, as what you said at the end about the visceral possibilities that they open. I mean, obviously when we can model with this degree of intricacy and with renditions that involve light, and we're going to encounter the buildings in ways we hadn't. So I'm very interested in that. I think the idea of returning to these things that way is fascinating. A slightly different question I wanted to ask, but it relates to it, but I was curious, I mean, I'm just struck by a very simple question. How significant was the discovery that this Renditore earlier rendition, that earlier version, is in fact the Renditore? I mean, how frequently or how often has it happened to you in all of the years you've been working on Palladio that you have found a way to understand again and attribute a new project to a different context? This, I mean, going to the question of context and that being real, this is seemed to me a very remarkably exciting discovery. I mean, I have to say, I was stunned by the fact that you mentioned that. I had never known about it. Should I have known about this?
Of course.
The Palladio, the situation, there's enormous literature that's flowed out recently, and one couldn't possibly keep up with it. If I hadn't been an editor of that paper, I wouldn't have. But well, I'll tell you, I made a new edition of my Palladio paperback a couple of years ago, and I was only allowed to change something in the text if it had exactly the same number of words as the page before. Uh, so I decided I wasn't going to do a lot of changing in the text, but I changed that one because it was bad to perpetuate a mistake like that, and I changed the attribution of the Palazzo Tieni in Vicenza from Palladio to Inigo Jones, candidate Giulio Romano. Because when Inigo Jones visited the Palladio buildings and made notes in his copy of the 4 books of Palladio, he said, it's said that this is designed by Giulio Romano, and it seems right. Anyway, that was rejected until quite recently. So I had to change those 2 things, the rest of them not.
Jim, I was curious about one thing, though, when you compared the drawing to the Pantheon.
Yeah.
And I was wondering about the relationship of the 2 pediments, which seem closer together in the Pantheon than they do. And it's almost, it's grist for your polemical mill, because it's even more magnificent in that sense, because it really sort of elevates one more clearly above the other. And I just wondered if that was a recalibration or not.
I just think that he was trying to get up there to the height of a Gothic vault.
Yeah.
That was the only thing. And you can see in the executed reditory, there's a lot of tricky work going on to make pediments relate to each other and to the rear of the church.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the things I talked to is your observation that unacceptable conditions had emerged when you modeled the Bologna project. And it struck me then that at a larger scale, where otherwise Palladio was trying to subsume everything under the authority of proportion relative to the earlier renditions of such examples, he was running into the same problem at a different scale. Accumulation of elements dislocated now by enormity rather than by accumulation.
Yeah.
So it was interesting, going back to Moses' point, that this model really brought that to bear. I mean, it was very clear that it was not limited. There was too much congestion when these scales were brought together that way. And they could give birth to a different kind of variation on the mannerist impulses
Yeah.
that followed in this kind of inquiry. Maybe, I mean, it's very interesting. But I mean, you see it kind of happening all over again.
Yeah.
Huge. Now, some people would criticize that in a kind of American version. They would just say it's vulgar. But in that context, it would be considered an honest error or problematic that emerges from different reasons.
Yeah.
Unrelated to pomposity and superficiality.
Well, there were so many problems in getting facades onto churches that you wouldn't fit the vocabulary. Our churches had to be built from the altar toward the front because they wanted services to go on as soon as possible, and they'd move steadily toward the front. Then they run out of money. And there are more facades that didn't get built in Italy than those that did get built, simply because it cost too much to ever get it done. Like San Lorenzo in Florence had a huge competition among the great architects of the time, and they got a lot of elegant designs, including Michelangelo's, and nothing happened.
But Scott has a really interesting point, and I'm thinking of its historical legacy. I mean, certainly Soufflot ran into issues when he tried to, get at Gothic lightness, and the dome starts to crack with classical elements. But in terms of the relationship between the real and some kind of fantasy of the problem, it's so nonetheless interesting that Boulez would then turn around on paper and use Soufflet's real church as a model to expand and make so large, so magnificent, that of course it's impossible or monumental. But nonetheless, it's an idea that has so much traction that it returns to the fantastical space of the page. And it's really interesting. I mean, this is almost an iteration, an earlier iteration of that.
It would be great if there are some comments. I think it would be, you know, I think one of the things that is at issue here is that maybe with the computer, for example, so many things have become easier to imagine also. So in some ways, it does raise certain questions about the relationship, for example, between modes of representation and questions of imagining, questions of imagination. How do architects and urban designers and landscape architects begin to sort of project about the future, and what are the methods that are at hand to help us imagine? So the explicit relationship between technique or tools and modes of constructing new forms of imagination is something that is probably important in the context of our school to discuss. I think one of the things that is I just think that there was more conversation around this perhaps 10, 15 years ago than it is today, was about the explicitness of the role of drawing. And in a way, it seems that there is some tendency towards a kind of naturalization of the status of drawing, simply because it's a lot easier to represent. It's a lot easier to make that kind of visualization of certain modes of designing or thinking. So I think this is actually a kind of very important thing. And in some ways, these reconstructions, to be honest, they do give me a certain level of anxiety in a way, because they have a kind of literality about them, and that literality, even though it's the work of Palladio, in some ways, it kind of makes it look like Bob Stern. I mean, in a way, that you do have this kind of, no, I mean, I do think that there is an issue of the utilization of certain modes at this moment, and the associations that they bring. So even though we know psychologically that this is still the work of Palladio, somehow there is a kind of presentness to this.
Reception. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't feel that actually, because I'm looking at them strictly, and Ole is commenting to me, of course, he's saying to me, well, you know, of course, this was never even realized in any like this at all. The conflict and problematic you've identified would not have been manifest by Palladio. Of course it wouldn't have been. But I see two things branching off from this. One is the way in which we imagine Palladio would have corrected the project. Now that we can see how impossible it is. And the other is a mannerism which continues in this direction and elaborates the error that it represents. I mean, even to a greater extent, because that kind of error is productive, actually, potentially. I'm more interested in linguistically. I guess I don't care whether or not it has the atmosphere of vulgarity as a rendering.
Oh no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that no, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that on the one hand there is the project of this in terms of its own history, its own historicity, which is what you're saying, and the problematics of that, and the fact that I feel at any moment we're also deeply embedded in the contemporaneity of our project, and the fact that what Jim showed, that look, this is what happened to this material, and when you look at Washington, then in some ways there is already our awareness of a different project at the same time, and so that's all. So I mean,
The thing I think is interesting about it, when you think about the book audio, and you think about the way the drawings idealize the villas, even to an extreme in certain cases, removing many of the characteristics in their fully realized state, altering very extremely, I mean really profoundly. We see already, this is another medium, we're just dealing
Well, certainly you're right about his book, that he did a book in 1570, and every building that he'd already finished, he redesigned for the book, because he wasn't happy with the way it was.
You have to wonder whether the redesigns would run into some of the problems at the Bologna.
Yeah, yeah.
The redesigns don't work, probably. Right? I would assume they would have, some of them would run into trouble.
Any questions, contributions from our students?
To this discussion about reconstruction, looking at it from the point of view of historic preservation, reconstructions in drawings and models are great for study. In a strange way, when they are built, you really feel this is not the real thing. And there's in part a simple explanation that the craftsmanship that went into the real Palladian buildings made them slightly irregular.
Mhm.
Those irregularities are almost difficult to realize. But it was just the way it was done when the stucco was up. Today, we can't order slight irregularities. The thing comes out always at right angles, absolutely sharp, and so on and so on. You don't think of that when you experience it, but it's there. I
But-
know when they reconstructed the famous sanatorium by Joseph Hoffmann, the one thing they just couldn't get right was the stucco on the outside, the render. They tried hard, but it isn't what it was. And if you knew the old stuff, you realize, no, look, this was a big mistake what they put up there. But nobody else except a few people realized that. And for the rest, one is glad that it has been restored. But there remains that ambiguity which cannot be erased.
But isn't that a contemporary preoccupation? I mean, for example, when you think about the way Palladio drew his villas and corrected them, it wasn't, it seems to me, it wasn't to capture the sensations of the material at all. It was just to represent the linear and composition in an altered form. And so when I look at these renderings, no matter how rectified and cold and antiseptic and vulgar according to different audiences, this isn't what they're about. So they're not about the material at all. And so I can overlook that. And I can take pleasure by squinting at it and even imagining that it would have had the characteristics you're speaking about had it been realized. So I can look at the rendering and I know that they do that. I know
Sure.
these renderings ruin the tactile character in it. So I look
Sure,
through that. I
sure.
ignore those problems because they don't help me. They will. I need to go directly to the question at hand in the rendering, which is what of these what are these proportions doing when manifest in that arrangement? If I get caught in these questions of the kind of material
Sure.
condition, I miss the argument that the model is trying to deal with.
Yeah, but it also shows a different kind of poem, which is that when Palladio was drawing those drawings, the projects were unresolved, and during the building, the issues were resolved. So the reconstructions, the renderings also help to reveal the true genius.
Mhm.
Yeah.
They reveal that discrepancy. Yes, that's very good.
You had a
Yeah.
comment there. Sorry.
I was very taken by the piece that you read having to do with magnificence
Yeah.
and the subsequent conversations about monumentality.